Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today we're going to talk about this paper called Past Life Memories in Foreign Languages, an exploration of xenoglossy in cases of the reincarnation type. And so this paper provides evidence of reincarnation, specifically from what's called xenoglossy. And that's when an individual speaks a foreign language that they shouldn't have access to. So in this case, we're talking about young children who are claiming to have lived a life previously and to remember their past life. And in some rare cases, they can actually speak the foreign language of their previous life, but they shouldn't have been exposed to that language in their current life. At least nobody knows how they were exposed to that language. Okay, so this is one of actually many studies talking about reincarnation. You might be surprised to find that there's actually a lot of scientific research on this topic. And so we're going to go through their background, talking about some of the other evidence of reincarnation, and then specifically we're going to talk about what they focus on, which again is xenoglossy. Okay, before we get into it, the reason this paper matters, it should be obvious, but if there's something to reincarnation, in the sense that at least some people can remember a previous life, then what that suggests is one, consciousness survives death, which has important implications, but two, people have the ability to access this consciousness of other people. In other words, some specific individuals have the ability to access information that previously living individuals had. Okay? So, one, it suggests we live beyond our earthly life. So it has very important spiritual implications and religious implications also. And then two, it might suggest the existence of some sort of collective consciousness where people can tap into that and draw information out of it. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to go through the paper now, talking about the background, some other evidence of reincarnation, how scientists study reincarnation, and then more specifically about the causes of xenoglossy within this. Okay. So, first they give some background on reincarnation as a general phenomenon. So they say, this phenomenon has been described in cultures around the world for a long time. And usually the way that it works is a subset of children express that they remember their previous life. So it says, children between the ages of 2 and 7 spontaneously express memories that appear to be from a life before their current existence. And it says basically there was this researcher, Ian Stevenson, who noticed this phenomenon in modern times and decided to investigate it scientifically. Okay, so he established this method and protocol for analyzing reincarnation cases and studying them and documenting them. And that protocol is still in use today. Okay, he calls them cases of the reincarnation type because not all people who study this are convinced that it's actual reincarnation. Like I said, some people believe that they're basically tapping into some sort of collective consciousness. And it's not so much that they are the previous person, it's that they're accessing the previous person's consciousness. Okay? So they give a brief overview of the protocol that they use. They say once a potential case of the reincarnation type has been identified, a trained researcher examines the evidence by systematically interviewing the child and all available sources who can provide first-hand information to support or refute the child's claims. Okay? And he says many of these cases eventually lead to the identification of a previous personality, which in turn extends the investigation to include family and community members associated with the deceased individual. So in other words, it usually starts by a child expressing that they remember their past life. Researchers get contacted. They go, they ask questions to the kid, to the family of the child, and ultimately they're able to not usually, but sometimes they're able to pinpoint another person who lived previously who matches the description. And then they go and they find that person's family and they find whether or not the child's claims about that person's life match the person's actual life. And what they say is that oftentimes there's a surprising amount of overlap between what the child claims and what actually happened in the previous person's life. He gives some examples, which we're going to talk about when we get there. But he talks about some other features of reincarnation. So first of all, there's this database, this court database, Cases of Reincarnation Type database. It's affiliated with the University of Virginia. So they have an entire department, the Division of Perceptual Studies, that studies unusual or anomalous things such as reincarnation, near-death experiences, and things like that, again, from a scientific angle. Anyways, they say in this database, which has like over 2,000 cases, they say there are 631 cases where there's an announcing dream or departing dream. And what that's referring to is with an announcing dream, a pregnant mother or a pregnant woman, she reports having had a dream where the previous person, like the person who's deceased, basically comes to her in the dream and either asks permission or announces that they are going to reincarnate within her future offspring that she's about to give birth to. Okay. Also, sometimes there's a departing dream where basically a family member of the deceased has a dream where the deceased person says that they're going to go reincarnate in a different person. Okay. So that's an interesting phenomenon. It seems to suggest that the deceased person, their spirit has some sort of agency even beyond the grave. Okay. Another interesting phenomenon associated with cases of the reincarnation type is oftentimes there's like a biological connection, they say, between the previous person and the new child who's born. So, for example, it's pretty common in reincarnation cases for there to be a birthmark or birth defect in the new child that is somehow linked to the previous person. So, for example, and they're going to give an example down here, if the previous person gets injured at a certain area of their body, it's not uncommon for the new child, the reincarnated child, to have a birthmark in that area. So they give an example here. They say, one such case involves a child known as NK who was born in India in 1982. They say a full account of this person's life and more can be found in this other paper that we're not going to go into. But he says, briefly, this case details a child born with a linear area of abnormal skin on the left front area of his head. Okay, so he has some sort of weird scar on his head. The child insisted that he was from a different village and that his name was Babu, not his given name. The child claimed he had been killed by robbers who hit him in the head with an axe. Eventually, investigators were able to identify a Babu from the village claimed by the child, who had been murdered in 1978. The investigation confirmed that Babu had been killed by robbers with an axe, just as the child and his birthmark suggested, a fact supported by Babu's post-mortem report. Okay, so that's another important part of this. Is the researchers, oftentimes they try to corroborate the evidence by looking at post-mortem reports of the deceased person to see if there's a link between what the child is saying. And again, these children have never met the deceased people and the deceased person. All right, so they say these sorts of birthmarks and birth defects related to a previous personality, especially when verified, are considered strong evidence by researchers of an anomalous explanation for the phenomenon. Okay, another interesting thing about reincarnation cases is oftentimes there's either a preference or a phobia in the child. Okay, so as an example of this, they say, there is, for example, the case of a Sri Lankan child, SP, who presented as severely phobic around water, especially at bath time, only to later express memories of having previously died as a result of drowning. And then they say, conversely, there are cases of children who show an unusual desire for certain items, like food and music, that link to the previous personality's known preferences, and even documented addictions. Okay, so it's almost like the child is inheriting more than just memories of the previous person, but even things like their addictions and their fears. And then they get down to what they focus on this paper, which is xenoglossy. So they say one of the most fascinating elements that has occasionally emerged over the years is the phenomenon known as xenoglossy. All right, this describes a case where a person is speaking or understanding a foreign language that they should not have learned or been exposed to previously and should not be able to speak naturally. So they say in that massive database of reincarnation cases, 41 of them have some form of xenoglossy. Okay, and they go on to talk more about it, but it varies from them being able to speak the language fluently or to them remembering just key words from that language. Okay, so there's a wide range of xenoglossy. But it's worth mentioning that you might have heard of xenoglossy in other contexts. So in things like demon possession, sometimes you have reports where the possessed individual starts speaking a language they shouldn't have access to. Okay. Also, this can happen in people with dissociative identity disorder, split personality. Okay, one of the personalities that emerges in their psychology evidently is capable of speaking a language that, again, they shouldn't have had access to. So xenoglossy pops up occasionally in other abnormal research areas. And again, this, in my mind, this could be interpreted as there being a collective consciousness that the mind is capable of tapping into. Okay, so with this collective consciousness, the idea is that individuals are sensing the world around them and processing it, and then they're basically sending information or recording information and sending it to this collective consciousness, which is a pool of information fed into by all conscious beings. And then evidently in some rare circumstances, the mind can pull information out of that also. So it probably suggests the existence of some sort of other realm, like a spiritual realm, where this information sits. There's other evidence for this besides just this paper. So I did a previous video on telepathy. There's actually a lot of strong evidence for telepathy. And there's also evidence for precognition, where people are basically able to sense the future. There's also evidence of remote viewing, which you might have heard about with like CIA experiments and things like that. There's documented cases of this where, for example, the CIA had people use remote viewing to look inside of Soviet bases to see what top secret technologies they were developing. And there's some accurate examples of this, which maybe we can cover some of that in a future video. Okay, but the point is, all of these different phenomena can be interpreted and understood through the lens of there being a collective consciousness, basically a repository of information about the world that is sort of held in a spiritual realm, if you want to use that term, and then it can be accessed by people in rare circumstances, okay? So they talk a little bit more about xenoglossy, but then they talk about some examples of this in their database. They say, another example of cases that provide fascinating claims of xenoglossy comes from an investigation in 1977 focused on two Burmese twin girls named Kin San Yin and Kin San Tin. Okay, so there's these twins, and basically they claimed that they remembered having been brothers in Japan previously fighting in World War II. And according to their family and others in the village that these twins grew up in, they were able to speak Japanese when they were young. Okay, and nobody else in the village knew that language or understood it. So that's a case of xenoglossy in this database. They give a few other examples, but I think you understand the point. The main thing that this paper actually looks at is what causes xenoglossy to appear in some cases, but not others. So what they do is they look at this database, which again has over 2,000 different cases of apparent reincarnation. And they want to know, in the cases that exhibit xenoglossy, is there anything in particular about those cases that makes them special compared to all the others in the database? So that's what they look at. So now we're going to get into their results. Okay, so what figure 1 is showing is basically the distribution of causes of death within this court database, the cases of reincarnation type database. So the way that you interpret this is basically this is the percent. So 42% of the people in this database of these cases of reincarnation, the deceased individual had died of a natural cause. Okay, that's relatively low, all things considered. So in the broader population, this number would be higher. More people die of natural causes. But when you're talking about the reincarnation cases, a lot of the deceased individuals who are allegedly reincarnating, they died of some sort of violent or unnatural death, like shooting or even suicide or drowning and things like that. So it seems that a lot of the reincarnation cases, the person who died, they died unnaturally and violently. Okay. Next, like I said, they look at what's specifically unique about the cases where they exhibit xenoglossy. We really don't need to focus on it. Really, the most interesting part of this paper is the introduction where they give background on reincarnation. But if you're interested in what specifically causes xenoglossy in certain cases, it correlates very highly with degree of emotion during recall. So let me explain that. First of all, the way that you interpret this table is the most important thing to look for is this column here beneath this P. So basically, if this number in this P column is below 0.05, then it's a statistically significant relationship with xenoglossy. So let's just give an example, this average parental education. So is the education of the parents of the child claiming to be the reincarnation of someone else, is their education level significantly related to their child expressing xenoglossy? The answer is no, because this number is not beneath 0.05. However, this number is well beneath 0.05 in these two rows, specifically the degree of emotion during recall and the mode of death. So let's start with the first one. The degree of emotion during recall, this is, as it sounds, when the child is made to recall or think about their previous life, basically how much emotion is associated with that. Okay, is it traumatic for the child? If so, they're statistically more likely to exhibit xenoglossy. Likewise, if their death, the death of the alleged person reincarnating through them, if they died violently, they're significantly more likely to exhibit xenoglossy for those children. Okay, and that's really all they find in this study. So it's a pretty short study. Like I said, what really matters here is all the background on reincarnation. It's important to emphasize that there is a lot of evidence for reincarnation. A lot of it is anecdotal, but they do verify as much information as they can about these children's stories. But it's part of a broader pattern of evidence of the paranormal, even though some people don't like that term. A lot of researchers don't even like that term. But it's things like telepathy, it's things like precognition, clairvoyance, and reincarnation, near-death experiences. There's a lot of evidence for a lot of that. And what this all suggests is that there is potentially a spiritual realm. The soul might live on past earthly death, and consciousness might survive. And people might even be able to tap into some sort of collective consciousness. So all of this has important religious implications. It has important philosophical implications. And maybe we'll talk about some of those other categories of evidence in future videos. But thank you for listening.